again. Just everyone's joining in. There we are. A few more people coming in. We'll let them in the waiting room. And there we go, a few more people there. And you're all very welcome to Behavioural Science Club. I'd encourage you all to put your screen onto gallery view so that you can see everybody else who's joined us today. And if you're brave enough to put your camera on, we like to see your faces. If you don't, or if you don't have the bandwidth, then we understand. And so today we are very pleased to welcome to join us Pete of PetesBITs. And if you don't already know what PetesBITs is is a YouTube channel that Pete set up himself. And I think it's been maybe going about the same length of time as our group, Pete, is it? Yeah, round about the same length of time. And I came across Pete through, he joined our group, and then I saw what he was doing on YouTube, and I saw he was just doing a great thing out there. I thought it was very brave, just throwing himself out there. And I'll tell you a little quick bit about his background, which is that he's studying for his master's. Is it under Wendy Wood, Pete?
No, I'm studying at the University of Warwick.
University of Warwick, that's right, at the University of Warwick. And the reason I wanted to invite Pete along today was because, you know, we've had a fantastic range of guests, very well-known speakers in the behavioural science world, authors, people who shared their experience of working in behavioural science. But I was just saying to Pete before we all joined you today that I'm always getting messages from young people who are starting out their career in behavioural science. And they're asking, how do I start out in this world, and who should I follow, and which books should I read? And I really admired that Pete had just like that thrown himself out there and shared what he was learning. And just recently he started doing some very interesting YouTubes where he sort of challenges people about some of the nonsense that's out there. So I'm going to hand over to Pete. He can share how he's so confident about doing this. And maybe just start, Pete, by telling everybody how you decided to launch into this, where you get your confidence from, and how you decide to choose the subjects of your programs.
Sure. So I started this YouTube channel about a year ago, about the same time as this club started. And just like this club, it's very directly related to nudge stock in a weird way. So prior to starting this YouTube channel, I was head of the Warwick Behavioural Insights team, which is like a student-run team of behavioral science enthusiasts. And I'm just, you know, I'm crazy about behavioral science and behavioral economics and stuff. And my team was in charge of organizing the Behavioural Insights Team Summit, which is basically like a light version of nudge stock. And our headline speaker was Rory Sutherland. And that's how I got in contact with Rory, which was amazing because Rory is a huge hero of mine, still is a huge hero of mine. And we got in contact with each other. And after he spoke at our summit, he asked to have a call with me. And because of COVID, I was forced to, rather than doing our summit in person, we had to upload it onto YouTube. And Rory said to me in our call, he says, it's really great that you're uploading these talks to YouTube, actually, because there's a real dearth of content. There's a real dearth of behavioral economics content on YouTube. And he talked about how nudge stock basically had added many hours of behavioral economics content to YouTube. And then after we had that conversation, it got me thinking, well, I know about behavioral economics. I know how to edit videos. I have a camera. Why don't I fill in this dearth that exists on YouTube? And that's what spurred me to start my channel. And this was round about the same time. I think it was, yeah, about a week after nudge stock. So I talked to Rory just before nudge stock, and then started my YouTube channel just after nudge stock, which is obviously when you guys started this club as well. So it all kind of coincided, and it's all related to Rory indirectly. Yeah.
Thanks, Pete. And if any of you haven't already looked at Pete's channel, you must hop on there. He just recently celebrated the fact that he'd got 2,000 subscribers. And I hopped onto a really interesting Q&A that he'd set up a couple of weeks back. And you were running it before you were launching one of your new videos. And I just found it really interesting, Pete, because you had this little group of sort of avid enthusiasts having a chat with you. And I just felt that you dealt with the Q&A really well. And during that time, you told this interesting story of going home, if you can tell everyone where you're from, and getting your teeth into reading Thinking Fast and Slow. Do you just want to tell them that story, Pete?
Yeah, sure. So this is a long time ago. This is maybe 7 years ago, which is how long I've been interested in this field. So I'm from the UK, but my family's from Malaysia. So I went to go visit my grandparents back in Malaysia. And my parents are from this very like rural village where there's literally nothing to do. Just internet is like rubbish, you know. And so because I just got into this behavioral economics stuff, my friend told me, you should read this book. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. I heard it's pretty important, if you want to get into behavioral economics. And so I brought it with me to Malaysia, and I was in the perfect environment to read it, because Thinking Fast and Slow is a really boring book. It's really, the knowledge in it is fantastic and it's priceless, but the way it's written is incredibly dry and academic. But because I was in this jungle, basically this rural third world village where there's nothing to do, that's all I had to do was read this book. And so I sat there and I read it from cover to cover, and that's how I completed Thinking Fast and Slow. And once you get past all the dryness of the book, it actually completely changes the way you look at the world. And it completely changed the way that I saw the world afterwards, because I suddenly was seeing all of these social forces around me in terms of system 1 and system 2. And and that really launched me onto this path of getting into behavioral economics.
That's a great story, Pete. And Janet Kahneman's there's been quite a few videos from him recently, because of course they're launching their new book Noise, so that's a really exciting event that's coming up. And we had our own stories about reading Thinking Fast and Slow, and Prakash put up a post a little while back challenging the fact that really anybody had read it. I'd had it on my shelf for 10 years and ended up putting up a post about the way I challenged myself to finish it by setting a number of pages to read every night, and I couldn't go to sleep until I'd read 4 pages minimum. And that was the way that I finally got back into the teeth of finishing the book. So that's a very interesting story, Pete. And so you made this big decision to launch into this site and start putting up videos. And it was quite a big task, because it's a big world out there of behavioral science. So how did you decide to start breaking it down and thinking, what content shall I put up there?
I think with any YouTube channel, anyone who wants to be kind of successful on YouTube, regardless of your subject, the first stage is very experimental. So I'm just kind of, if you look at my early videos, my plethora of early videos, it's very like variable, the type of content I'm putting up. Sometimes I'm just focusing in really hard on one particular cognitive bias. Sometimes I'm focusing in on a more grand idea. Maybe I'm looking at behavioral science from a more abstract angle. And the visual style was very different as well early on. It's very experimental. And what you're really doing is just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. And you're just trying to see what people are interested in. Now I've got a bit more practice, and I'm kind of seeing a bit more, which videos consistently perform well. I realized that what people are really interested in is how they can apply behavioral science to their own life, and how they can use the lessons from behavioral science to live happier and healthier and wealthier lives. And so that's kind of where I'm steering my channel these days, is to focus more on that aspect of things, because I think I can add more value to people that way. And
Pete, you did a very interesting video. Sorry to jump in there. You did a very interesting one recently where you sort of called out a fair amount of nonsense that's out there, which I think is a good theme. that you're going along. Maybe just tell the members a little bit about one of those videos that you particularly enjoyed, and why you decided to go about that type of theme.
Yeah, sure. So I started this series called Fact Checked, which is by far my most popular series on my channel. And the idea behind this series was that I would find a video where somebody is talking about behavioral science, but, you know, almost certainly the person talking about behavioral science isn't qualified to do so. Like, then they haven't studied, they've read like one book or something, and then they make a video about it, and they don't really understand what they're talking about. And so I would do this series called Fact Check, where I'd watch their video and then comment about what they got right and what they got wrong. And then at the end of the video, I'll give them a score of like how accurate they were in terms of their behavioral science knowledge. And that series seems to resonate with a lot of people. I think it plays very well into YouTube in the sense that, you know, you have these two videos, so it's naturally diverse in shots, because you just kind of flip between the two videos, between me and the person I'm watching. And so it plays into the format of YouTube very nicely. And it's also kind of fun because, you know, I get to kind of call out these channels with a lot more subscribers than me.
Yeah. They're very funny. I must encourage you to go and look at them. The one I particularly liked was was it called a dopamine fast, Pete? And so it was fantastic. It was just a lot of sort of stop. I really enjoyed them. And you fairly took that one apart, didn't you, Pete?
Thank you. Yeah, so there's this trend on, if you guys haven't seen the video, there's this trend on the internet of people doing this thing called the dopamine fast or a dopamine detox, where the claim is that if you spend a day doing nothing, and when I mean doing nothing, I mean literally doing nothing. Like you don't watch anything, you don't use any devices, you don't do anything fun, you don't meet any friends, you don't even eat food, you just do nothing for a day, and you have to meditate. The only things you can do is meditate or journal or sleep. And if you do that for a day, they claim that your dopamine levels will drop, and then the next day when you wake up, you will feel more motivated to do boring things because your baseline of dopamine has dropped. That's what they say, but these people are not psychologists or remotely qualified to talk about the subject. And basically I break down how this whole concept of your dopamine dropping after one day of doing nothing is flawed in many ways. And your dopamine, first of all, doesn't readjust after one day. Your receptors don't respond that quickly to a lack of stimulation. And also, you know, you can't fast from dopamine because it's a naturally occurring chemical in your body, right? You can't fast from dopamine any more than you can fast from red blood cells. You know, it's part of you. And so I sort of break down, but the thing is, the practice actually would likely work. That was the conclusion of the surprising conclusion of the video, that despite the bad justification for the behavior, it actually would have the correct behavioral effect, but not because of dopamine. And the conclusion to the video was that if you think about what you're actually doing on a dopamine fast, is you're spending a whole day meditating and journaling. And if you spend a whole day meditating and journaling, there's a good chance that what you're actually affecting is your levels of cortisol, which is your stress hormone. And so if people have lower cortisol, then they're going to get better sleep. They are going to be able to focus more. They're going to be able to come up with more creative solutions to problems. And we have evidence for that in psychology. And so I conclude in that video that dopamine detoxing works, but not because of dopamine, because of cortisol. And so that was the video. And that video did very well. It got like 2,000 views in like a day or something, which was like crazy. So
it was very interesting. I really enjoyed it. And just going back to the Q&A that I jumped on with you a couple of weeks back, were you surprised at the level of engagement? And I mean, you kept it going for an hour before launching then your new video, and I wondered if you were sort of surprised by the engagement from the people who jumped onto the call.
Yeah, I'm always surprised. I mean, I'm surprised that anyone wants to watch my videos ever, to be honest. Like, it's funny when people like actually care. And so I did this live stream, and people would come in and talk to me. And I've done a few of them now, and I found it like a really fun way to engage with my audience, more kind of similar to how we're doing this call now. It's more dynamic than just let me film a video, put it on YouTube, and then you guys just react to the video, and that's the end of our interaction. Instead, we can have more of this live conversation, and I can go into more depth because it's a longer form live stream rather than like a short, 8 to 10 minute video.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable. It popped up by chance, and I was in the garden, and I thought, oh, I'll jump in on that. And then I really enjoyed it, and I found the questions that the other people were asking you were really interesting. And it was also interesting to see the type of people that engaged with you on that video. And as you say, it was similar to what we're doing here today, which is always nice to interact with the people. It's a completely different dynamic, as Prakash was saying earlier, than when you have a standard webinar event that you sign into and you're just very sitting there watching what's going on. So thanks so much for that introduction, Pete, to tell those of the people who don't know about your channel. And it seems from some of the comments there that you've got a fair number of fans here today. And I'm just going to hand over to Prakash now for a couple of questions, and then we'll open the questions up to the members. So thanks very much, Pete.
By the way, thanks everyone who's here. Thank you for, if you're one of my subscribers and you enjoy my videos, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Louise and Peter. I see a lot of new names today in the audience. So for everyone who is joining us for the first time out here, a big hello from us. Please feel free to go to a gallery mode so that you can see who else is joined in. Please feel free to exchange your LinkedIn IDs, your Twitter IDs, make new friends. This is a club. So while you also want to listen to what Pete is teaching us and telling us, we also want to make new friends out here, right? And that's how we have become friends with each other. So please do that. Pete, I had no idea that we were actually connected in the sense that there is Rory Sutherland at the center of it. So that's a fantastic thing to discover. He was instrumental in us getting the club started. In a way, he was our first guest. It's a freaky coincidence that at some level, Nutstock brought so many people together, the Nutstock last year. I was trying to experiment with podcasts, and then I realized the world does not need one more podcast, and Nutstock happens, and people are asking for a book club, and I'm putting up a club. Luckily, Louise put up a fantastic list of books, which goes viral. So I reach out to her, and boom, today here we are. And it's lovely that you also started your channel at the same time. One quick question here, Pete. There is an aspect of age, which I think want to bring in here. Most of the people that we know who are right now in the world of behavioral science, right? These are people who are what you can call a lateral move. They have been doing X, Y, or Z for 10, 15, 20 years. And at some point of time in the last couple of years, they've decided to move down towards behavioral science, whether intentionally or whether, through an evolution of their career, which also means most of the people may not really have a formal education. People who are applied practitioners, it is a lot of learning, a lot of experience and putting things together. And I noticed you said that one of the reasons you put your channel together was to be able to correct what people say. Or they're saying, okay, let me actually look at it from little science point of view. Is this something that you have observed? Is this something that bothers you as someone who's very young? And in the sense, I bring in the youth out here because you've recently, I think, done a fantastic course, and you're on this journey, and there's an entire future ahead of you, right? How do you see this? It's a little vague question, I know, but take it whichever way you want, Pete.
Yeah. So it's a good observation that you're making. The way I see our field, the field of behavioral science at the moment, is it's basically we're in generation 3 right now. So if you think of generation 1 as the pioneers, so you had Kahneman, Tversky, Thaler, these guys, right, who are like laying down the groundwork, the theoretical groundwork in academia for this field to exist. That's generation one. And then for the last, I don't know, 10 to 15 years, we've had generation two, where we have people from lots of different fields who were not directly in behavioral science, now coming into behavioral science, like you said. And where I see myself and people who are like myself, who from university age set out to have a career in behavioral science, because this infrastructure is now in place where that is a feasible career option for people, that we set out from university to study, to then do a master's or a PhD and then come into the field. We're the third generation. And so I kind of see my channel and I guess myself as being the representative of generation three of behavioral science, that we are this new generation who's going to bring in the next frontier of the field for the next 15, 20 years. And we're the ones who are purpose-built behavioral scientists from the beginning. And that gives us a different point of view as well. And it makes us more specialist and hopefully better at our craft than the generations that came before us.
So this gap which exists, what I mean is you've got people typically around 40 years of age, the median age, who are applied practitioners. So they've got, let's say, around 15 years of experience in the industry. And within that first decade, at the end of it, they moved on towards behavioral science. And then you have people who've got 1 year, 2 year, 3 years kind of an experience. And there's a gap. And the people 1 to 3 year experience are people who've just got out of a Warwick, a UCL, LSE, and have got a very hardcore, legit education in this field. And then if you look at experiences of 3 years onwards to 15 years, I think it's a gap almost, right? So you've got people who are very young and then people who are like around 40. So that brings in the question of two different generations communicating with each other, right? So has there been any observation that you've had with people who are, I'm not trying to put you in trouble, right? Has there been any observation though about people from, our generation, put it like that? When it comes to working with them, we always hear our perspective of the younger generation. What is the younger generation thinking about the elder folks?
I mean, it's behavioral science. The strength of it is that it's collaborative, and the fact that the field evolved from all of these different areas is actually what makes it so great. Is that the boundaries of where behavioral science ends is not really clearly defined, and so I think that the way that the important thing now, if I continue using my generation model, right, like the important thing now when we're in this transition phase between generation 2 and generation 3, is that we communicate as much as possible and try and get rid of the stuff that we now know from previous generations doesn't work. I think that's the really important part. So that's part of the reason why I do fact checks. That's part of the reason why I make videos about ideas that don't replicate well, because we need to get rid of some of these bad models and bad ways of thinking about human behavior that we've had from previous generations. So stuff like priming, right, for example, is a huge chapter in Kahneman's book, but it doesn't work, right? It doesn't replicate. It's not reliable, and even if it does kind of work, it has like tiny effect sizes. Same thing with information-based campaigns, right? Information-based campaigns rarely work in the real world of practical behavioral science, right? Like you have to implement them very carefully to get them to work. And so it's why I make videos, like I made a video recently about why calorie labels don't change people's eating behavior, right? And I go into a lot of depth about how behavioral scientists have redesigned the calorie label again and again and again. We've tried different interventions again and again and again. And if you guys are watching from the UK, you might know that Boris Johnson recently made it mandatory for restaurants over a certain number of employees to put calorie information on their menus, which is an extra cost to businesses to do that, with the idea that this would reduce calorie consumption and help tackle obesity. But if you look at the evidence, right, because we're an evidence-based community, if you look at the evidence, this stuff doesn't work. And yet people are still trying it and still putting resources into it. And so in this transitional phase now, we need to sort of weed out, right? These are the old growing pains, the early ideas in the field that we're trying to get rid of. And we're trying to now disseminate and refine behavioral science into more effective strategies that are more likely to work. And that's where I see this little bit of friction in this transitional phase, is where some people are still latching onto these original ideas of behavioral science, even though they don't seem to replicate very well.
I noticed you talked about things being done which don't really work, or putting down a disproportionate amount of effort or investment. And the keyword is disproportionate because they don't really give you the right ROI. And if you could, right, how would you think things should change? What I mean is, for people who are a part of the system, people who have been doing things a certain way for quite some time, that is their reality. What you see is all that there is, right. And that is the world that they live in. And someone like you who's got a fresh perspective on behavioral science, in fact, I've almost not heard anyone talk about priming and how it doesn't really replicate. So you have that point of view. And of course, the world is yours to take. I mean, the next generation has to take over some point of time, right? So I think the two questions would be, I'm trying to frame it right. Number one is, how could people who are in charge, whether it's politicians, whether it's CXOs, whether it is the current set of behavioral strategists who have come down through lateral point, how could they ensure that they are not falling in the trap of doing things? Number one. And number two would be, how would you keep yourself in check as you progress on your own path to make sure that you do not repeat these mistakes, which you can see people beyond a particular age doing it?
Yeah, so there's a few answers to this. Let's look at this from a behavioral science point of view. Okay, so in behavioral science, we know that people have this thing called confirmation bias. And in academia, sometimes you might hear it called biased assimilation, or sometimes it's called the ostrich effect, when people bury their head in the sand, they don't want to listen to counterfactual opinions. All of these biases, what they mean is that when we believe something, we overweight information that confirms what we already believe in, and we underweight information that contradicts us. And this is one of the ideas in behavioral science that does replicate very well. And it actually, evolutionarily speaking, which is another thing that I try to bring into my videos a lot, which is talking about evolutionary psychology. From an evolutionary point of view, it actually is beneficial for people to do that, because even if you have a bad opinion, a wrong opinion, if you believe in it really strongly, more people are likely to rally behind you. But the problem with a developing field like behavioral science is that when too many people have confirmation bias, we have this issue of, we only talk to people who agree with us, right? Because it's more pleasant. And we only, and we underweight counterfactual information that says that what we've always believed in is wrong. And so how do you overcome this? So one thing that I see people, I think you might have had, did you have Jez Groom on here before?
Yeah, Jez was here as one of our guests.
Right. So one thing that people like Jez Groom, who run these consultancies, do is they continually encourage the influx of young talent into their companies, right? It's that they bring in these new people from generation 3, from my generation, who are trained in behavioral science, who have a really strong grounding in the scientific method, and they bring them in to bring in these fresh perspectives, because and it starts off with recognizing that perhaps we have old ideas that are wrong, and we bring in new people to try and change our ideas, and we try to talk to people who have differing ideas to ourselves. And it's hard, like it's genuinely hard, right? If you think about, what news stations do you listen to, right? You probably listen to the same news station all the time, right? So if you're from like the UK or the USA, you probably don't watch Russia Today very often, right? Russia Today is going to give you a very counterfactual point of view to what you have, and you don't listen to it because it sounds unpleasant. Like, oh, they're speaking positively about Putin. What? But it's hard. It's hard to hear, you know, these counterfactual pieces of information. It's the same with China, right? If you like, you know, nobody watches like Chinese news, and they talk about, you know, how great the Chinese party is doing, because it's much easier for us to just believe whatever our leaders have told us in the past, that China's this horrible country, when actually they're doing pretty well compared to us. So it's hard for us to hear these counterfactual opinions. So the first step is to recognize that you have this confirmation bias. And then the second step is to engage your system to engage your effort for cognition and talk to people who disagree with you. And that's the best that you could, and it'll never be perfect. You can never perfectly get a balanced point of view, but it's better than just, you know, being in this echo chamber bubble that you've always lived in, where you just talk to the people who agree with you. And I can give you an example of myself as well, right? So like from when I started my channel to now, my point of view about many aspects of behavioral science has changed. So if I watch back my first video, which was behavioral economics explained in 9 minutes or less, it's like an introduction to behavioral economics video, I put this paradigm in the video where it's the generation one idea that economics and behavioral economics are these rival factions, and that you know, everyone in economics is wrong, everyone in behavioral economics is right, us versus them, me versus you. That's the paradigm that I put into the video. And if you look at the thumbnail, I have a screenshot from Leonardo DiCaprio's movie where he's being attacked by a bear. And I label the bear as behavioral economics, and then I label Leonardo DiCaprio's mangled body as economics. My point of view from that video, which I made 11 months ago now, has changed. And that I no longer believe that economics and behavioral economics are these opposing fields. In fact, I think that instead, behavioral economics is just the next evolution of economics, and that a lot of people who are working in economics, who trained in traditional economics, are adopting ideas like prospect theory and loss aversion and, you know, all of these behavioral theories into their economic models now. And so it's not like they're opposed to behavioral science. That's a very old idea that was maybe true back when Kahneman first wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, but it's 2021 now, right? We've got to evolve. People have moved on, and people accept it's more widely accepted now. Another example would be defaults, right? Default bias. Okay, so default bias is very, you know, it does replicate well. It's a very powerful effect, and I talk about the very famous Johnson and Goldstein paper, which is like, this is organ donation with default, this is organ donation without default. Ones with default are really high, these ones are really low. Right, and it seems like super dramatic and great. Then let's take the analysis one step further, right? If you look at the data again, you take the analysis one step further. Okay, these are the number of people who consent to organ donation. These are people who don't. How many of those organs actually make it to being used, right? How many of those, you know, we have, okay, so the consent level is really high, but does it translate into actually more donations? It's actually not that big an effect, because there's other barriers in between those steps. Right, so just just changing the default bias once is sometimes not enough, and you've got to kind of take a more holistic view, a systems view, and that just, you know, we like to talk about these dramatic effects because they market behavioral economics really well. They sell the idea of behavioral economics really well, but sometimes it's not enough. You got to look at other things as well. And so, you know, these kind of more, I hate to use the word nuanced because it's overused, but these more nuanced, subtle ways of thinking about the holistic system of decision making is how my point of view has changed as well. And so it's sort of being open to the idea that you're wrong, and try to talk to people who disagree with you, and as a result, you end up growing as a person more.
Oh, that was a fantastic answer, Pete. Thank you so much. I think everyone has paid attention to what I talked about. You are not listening to Russia Today, and there are people who are listening to Russia Today, and as it might surprise you that people in China probably don't share your point of view of, you know, that their life is bad, or they don't have democracy, or whatever, freedom of speech. They might be really very happy with their system, which kind of also ties on to the next question which I have. It's around context. Meanwhile, folks who are listening in, please start sharing your questions because we want to start the Q&As now. Pete, one last question here is, you've talked about changes, generation 1, 2, and 3, and you talked about the context itself, looking at different things. And you said, your family is originally from Malaysia. I'm assuming you're in the UK right now.
Yep.
What has been your experiences, anecdotal as well as academic, when it comes to tying down cultural context, realities of cultural context, how that shapes people's behavior? And then you look at bias and heuristics, and how do you play with all together and say, okay, this is the dance that's happening. How have we seen that?
So this is one direction that behavioral economics is moving in a big way, and we have a huge international audience here, and that kind of is testament to how diverse our field is. And one of the biggest problems that my generation is having with the studies, like with the literature that currently exists, is that too much of it is what we describe as weird. And weird is an acronym, and it stands for Western, economically developed, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Basically, we just do studies on white people, and white people are a minority in the world, and that you can't really assume that whatever is true for white students from top universities is going to replicate across all of humankind, right? Like, people are different, cultures are different. And so this is one direction that behavioral science is moving in now, is trying to, hey, let's see, does our study, well, there's two steps to it. The first step is to say, okay, we'll do it on university students in America, but we're also going to repeat the same study in Botswana, right? And see, does it replicate in both scenarios? And if the effect replicates in both scenarios, then okay, maybe it's more universal. And then the other side of it is to then go into an individual culture and say, okay, well, what applies to this culture in particular? Because the forces that are in the environment for this culture will be different to another culture. So at the moment it's under researched. The main separation that we have at the moment is just between East and West, which is hopeless because it's, that's so many countries, but East and West, and they say, well, Eastern cultures are more collectivist, whereas Western cultures are more individualist. So in Western cultures, it's all about myself and how I can further myself and progress, and that's kind of the motivation for most people. Whereas in Eastern cultures, people are more likely to think about, how do my actions affect my society? How do my actions affect my family? How does that affect the reputation of my family? And these different psychological processes mean that the barriers to behavior change are different, right? And so when you think about these different cultures, it changes the way you apply incentives. It changes the way that you structure your choice architecture, because you have to account for these differences in culture. There's a group of behavioral scientists that has Christian Hunt, Sebastian Fonzo, Jez Groom, Alina Hallinan. A bunch of these people are getting together with this team of people to try and unpack this question. And they just talk with each other to try and unpack this question of, how does individual culture change behavior? But beyond that, right, a lot of people so this is me being extra meta on myself. So people in my generation love to hop on this train of, oh, weird studies are really bad because, the world isn't just weird people. And they love to go on that because it's really woke, right? It makes them seem really woke, like, oh, the world is not just weird people. But what's more important than consistency across cultures is consistency of the situation, right? So one problem with how behavioral economics was marketed in the early stages in Gen 2 was that it was it was marketed in the sense that you could say, well, we did this lab study on 15 people with very controlled conditions, in a university, and that can replicate. Then we can apply that insight to some farm in Venezuela. Like, no, right? You can't, right? Like, you can't. The further you extrapolate your result from the paradigm in which it was originally investigated, the less likely that result is to replicate in that context. And that's kind of why we have if you talk to applied behavioral scientists, they'll tell you, yeah, behavioral science is really hard. Like stuff that we try doesn't seem to work all that well a lot of the time. And it's because you're taking this insight from the lab and you're trying to apply it outside of the lab, and they look very different. And so, the lab studies are important for controlling things, but also trying to have consistency of situation. So what's interesting now is in the world of practicing behavioral science is that if people in practicing behavioral science learn from each other, then they can see, okay, well, we're now operating in similar markets with similar groups of people, and keeping that context the same is going to allow you to replicate results better than just worrying about, weird versus non-weird people. Like because here's the thing, humans are even though we look really different, we're generally pretty similar. Like our biology is the same, the way we evolved is pretty similar, right? So I believe that keeping the situation consistent is more important than worrying about whether people look different inside the situations. But that's my controversial opinion.
Thank you so much for the large elaboration. And for folks who have been curious about this group that Pete spoke about, Jez Gru, Melina, Sebastian Fonzo and all, I share the link with there or the chat box. You can check out the group, look at more what they do. It's a group called Diversify Global. They all work together out there. I'm happy that you were able to bring the difference of East versus West. It's not just East itself. Like even in East, you got Japan, Korea, you got China, and then you got Vietnam, there's Cambodia, there's Malaysia, and then where do you put India? It was also a nice relation to realize that India is not considered as East in this East versus West, because Nisbet makes a distinction saying, I'm talking about East in terms of Korea, Japan, and China only. So where do you put the entire country? We've got like more than 1 billion plus people last I checked. So
have you been to Japan? Right, like Japan is bonkers, right? Japan is so bonkers compared to China, and when I went to Japan, my mind was blown. I was like, this country is so different to everything else. How can you lump Japan in with Malaysia? It's night and day. The people look similar, but the culture is completely different. Completely different.
Yeah, you're right. I want to bring in Louise here. I think we've got a lot of questions outcoming. Guys, please start sharing your questions. We start the Q&A, Louise. All yours.
Thanks very much, Prakash. And I love that you've called so much out, Pete. You're obviously a very individual thinker, and I just find it so refreshing. I'm relatively new to the subject myself, but I think when you come to a subject at this age, where you've obviously read widely before you join it, you come with a lot of questions, which is, I love to hear people asking questions. And I love that you're having original thoughts about the subject, because quite frankly, I'm sick to death of people just joining conversations and repeating the Kahneman line all the time, because it's great literature, it's great learning, but quite frankly, look, we all know it, and let's move on and have some original thought. So it's really inspiring. So thanks so much, Pete. Joanne, you asked a couple of questions. Would you like to jump in and have a chat with Pete?
Yeah, Pete, thank you so much for your talk. And I just loved your last comment, because I was just thinking about, in the UK, the difference between Scots, the Irish, the English, and the Welsh is, we look the same, but there's such, and even in my home country of Ireland, the divisions based on religion is just incredible, and has, as you're probably aware, has caused immense problems over the years. But what my question was that you've mentioned a few times about, they've just got these behavioral science experiments, interventions have just resulted in such a small effect. But what I would counter there or ask you is, like, it's a small effect, but the costs involved in achieving a small effect over a whole population can be actually, a tremendous benefit. I'm thinking of I think it's Carl Duerk's work about the growth mindset versus the fixed mind. And she has this intervention that costs like something like 25 cents at go, where the child goes online and completes an assessment or sort of gets extra help with tuition. That costs 25 cents. The only thing that will really bring a child's grades up is, you know, a private tutor for an hour, you know, so, which I grew up with in Ireland. You know, everybody pays for their, we call them grinds, tutors for an hour. That gets your child's grades up. While 25 cents a shot, you can spread it out quite, you know, amongst, you know, those who can't afford that personal tutor for that hour or 2 hours a week. So isn't that something to consider?
No, totally. I'm not saying that behavioral interventions are ineffective always, right? Like I wouldn't be in this
effect.
Yeah,
like,
no, it's,
yeah, they have a small effect, but if you
yes.
spread it out and it costs so little.
No, totally, yeah, no, and that's kind of the main sales point of behavioral science, right? So
yeah.
Some other examples would be like there was a study on children education again, where one thing that you can do to easily improve grades in low income neighborhoods is just provide kids with free glasses if they need them, right? It sounds so, that's the thing with behavior, is these trivial ideas, right? But it's like, if you're a kid and you can't see the board that your teacher is referencing, you're not going to do well. And so if you just provide glasses, which only cost the state, you know, less than 10 pounds per student, that's going to have a huge impact on their grades in the long term. Another example, a more recent example, would be Katie Milkman's work on getting COVID-19 vaccines to people in America, right? So she led this huge team of people to figure out how the intervention was using text messages, right? And text messages are extremely low cost way to roll out widespread interventions, but she was testing which text message is the best for getting people to actually show up and get the vaccine. And what they found was that if you use the endowment effect, so the endowment effect is when people value things that they own more than things that they don't own. And so if you reframe getting the vaccine in terms of the endowment effect, so you say to them, you have a vaccine reserved for you and your appointment is at this time. And so what that does is, to the people who receive this message, they then have ownership of the vaccine. Then they therefore are more likely to show up for the actual appointment because they feel like, oh, well, this is not just a vaccine, this is my vaccine, right? And that difference got 11% of people, 11% more people to show up to their vaccine appointments. And that's why looking at these effect sizes in context is important, because like you say, a small effect size in a big population can make a big difference. 11% spread across hundreds of millions of Americans is a big deal for an intervention that costs basically nothing, right? Because it's texts. So yeah, no, you're 100% right there, Joanne. Like small effect size in a big population can have really great effects. Totally.
Thank you. Thanks, Jan. Great answer, Pete. Thanks very much. Tony, you put a message in earlier on. You were chatting about social versus scientific. Would you like to put your questions, Pete?
Oh, well, my comment was, and then I'll roll into a question, is that you know, we like to have freewheeling conversations around the dinner table, and one of the big topics here in the United States. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Can you hear me?
Totally.
Okay, perfect, thanks. One of the big topics here in the United States is, you know, we just seem to have such different things going on. It's like, you know, something will happen and then, you know, the left will say, well, you know, that means X, and then the right will say that means Y. And, you know, sometimes I'll tune into Fox News and they'll take the same event and they'll spin it a totally different way. And you go, oh my God, what if I'm wrong? You know, what if I'm the nut job, right? And I'll have sometimes, you know, I'll bring these thoughts and conversations and questions to the dinner table, and oh my gosh, if I can touch a nerve, I can really touch a nerve, and people get pissed off at me. It makes for fun conversation. But there's a lot of social pressure to conform, and there's a lot of you got to be thinking the right way about things, or else you're not one of us, type of conversations that go on around the table, because the environment I grew up in, I grew up around conservative people, a very Christian environment, and I've moved way beyond that, but I sort of understand how that world thinks. And so how do you, I guess maybe the question, I'm sorry, Pete, I'm just going on and on, but maybe the question is, how can we have a conversation about what is, how can we have a conversation about controversial topics and not make it seem like we're agreeing with those controversial topics? So how can we have a conversation around, did Trump really win the election, and there's some sort of deep state conspiracy, without making it seem like, yes, I'm a QAnon supporter, for example.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a big question, I know, but that's the one I always struggle with in my conversations.
It's very difficult thing to get right, and it can very quickly devolve into just people shouting at each other.
Right.
The key, well, there's two strategies. The first strategy is to only attack the argument and not the person you're arguing with, right? So only question their logic and never let that devolve into you're stupid, right? Because that's when people get angry, is when you attack their identity rather than just their logic. The other thing to do is to try and raise the complexity of the conversation that you're having. Okay, so one strategy that I really like is to pretend like you agree with them, or imagine that you're someone who agrees with them, and then really try and work out the nuances of how they want to carry out their plan. Okay, so you might have a Trump supporter being like, we should kill all of the Democrats, right? Right, and then you say, okay, you know what? I agree with you. We should kill Democrats. How do you want to do it? Should we execute them by shooting squad? Do you want to put them in electric chairs? Do you want to use concentration camps? How do you want to do it? And then, and when you start raising the complexity, you start asking them, okay, I agree with you. How do you want to do it? Then people go, oh, okay, I was just kidding, right? And they kind of backtrack. They're like, I don't actually want to kill everyone. I was just using expletive language because that helps me get my point across. And so you want to raise the complexity and get people to really talk about the practical, because the problem with why we see increases in polarization and why social media, one of the reasons why social media increases polarization is because by nature the arguments have to be extremely simple, right? On Twitter you only have 280 characters to make your point, and what that means is that your point has to be extremely simple. You can't, if you write a long article, right, it's not, your Twitter post isn't titled discuss, right? It's just, I'm going to make my point and then you either agree with me or you don't. And the problem with these simple arguments is that you can't really piece together the complexities of the issue that you're dealing with, and that's why we see these further extremes. Whereas if you get people talking with each other and try to find some compromise, try find common ground and points that you agree with, then you'll see more trends towards the center in people's thinking. And so by raising the complexity of the argument, so rather than just arguing about the one central point, try and increase the complexity and then try find some area of that complexity that you can find common ground on, and then hopefully you can come together. But again, it's not easy. It's a very difficult thing to get right.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks, Pete. You're certainly seeing the world very clearly for us, and we're having the wisdom of youth at today's event. So I'm sure everyone's absolutely delighted to hear you cutting through some of the bullshit. Now, are you still with us, Simran? You had a good question for Pete. Simran Sharma? I'll ask Simran. Oh, super,
Yeah,
super.
hello, ma'am. Yes, so I had a lot of questions, but the recent one which I would like to ask is, so this is in reference with your video. So on an ethical scale, do you think that apps like Tinder capitalizes over the insecurities of people, and specifically the younger demographic masses in which they deal with, and specifically, in an age where people are more in idea of falling in love than the person they are with? So how can such organizations be more ethically aware while designing a particular kind of products, and how can behavioral science can incentivize or motivate such organizations? I don't know if my question might sound stupid because I'm really new to this field, but I was really curious to know. So thanks for giving the opportunity.
Thanks, Simran. Yeah, Peter, I guess this is referring to your dating video, so fire ahead.
All right, thanks, Simran. Okay, so there's a few questions there. Okay, the first one is, do social media sites, I guess you can, if you count Tinder as a social media site, do these websites prey on people's insecurities, right? And there's a trend in popular media to really vilify social media companies and say that they're really bad for our mental health and our self-esteem. But actually, the research is more mixed than popular media would have you believe. So, so to boil down the research very simply, if you look at other people's profiles on social media, you feel worse about yourself, your mental health suffers. But conversely, if you look at your own posts and your own profile, your self-esteem actually goes up. And so it balances out that way in terms of mental health. And then on the other side of things, there's also evidence to suggest that using social media can help people feel more connected to their friends, can help people feel more connected to their loved ones, and that also benefits you. So social media isn't all bad, that's the first thing. But of course, they do prey on our insecurities. I saw Ruth Dale is in this club earlier. I was on Ruth's podcast a few months ago now, and we were talking about TikTok and the design of TikTok. And what I said there was that you can use behavioral science, you can use a concept from behavioral science called friction, and reframe friction in terms of UX design, in terms of exit points. So when you're using these platforms, they are deliberately built to not have exit points. And so you have bottomless scrolls. That's generally the design. And it's the same for Tinder, it's the same for TikTok, it's the same for Twitter, Facebook. All of these platforms don't have exit points. You keep going, and there's no kind of natural stopping area in the experience. And when you have this automatic, frictionless experience, your retention on the platform will be longer. And I would advocate for these companies to show a bit of humanity and realize that their platforms are highly addictive, and introduce these friction exit points. And that's how they can introduce a kind of more ethical user design, which I think would actually improve their public perception in the long run. Because it's not like they're not getting enough usage as it is. It's just that right now there's literally zero exit points. And to give another example to make this more clear, Netflix and YouTube, which is where I am, uses the same mechanism with a feature called autoplay. So after you finish one video, the next one queues up automatically. And this is, again, removing an exit point. So normally when you finish watching a video, that's a natural exit point for you to leave the platform. But because it automatically queues up the next one, we end up binging a whole series on Netflix in one go, because it's so easy. And so so that's putting the onus on social media sites, but in your own life, you can also use software and settings to help yourself this way. So turn off autoplay, even on my videos if you want. Turn off autoplay, and you won't feel so compelled to spend so long on the platform. And on social media sites, you can download Chrome extensions, browser extensions, which help to limit, how much time we spend on the platform. And they'll give you like notifications and little alerts to kind of bring to your attention, hey, look, you've spent 3 hours on social media. Maybe it's time for you to do something with your life, So these are little things that you can do to manipulate your own environment and use behavioral science to your own advantage.
Thanks very much, Pete. And it's just coming up to the hour, so we haven't got time for any more questions. Pete, I really want to thank you so much for such a lively and fun conversation. I hope everybody else who's joined us has enjoyed it. I've seen plenty of smiles and nods, and so I think that they have. And whilst I've got you all here, I'd like to remind you that Katie, whom Peter mentioned, Katie Miltman, is joining us in a couple of weeks, but it's going to be on a Friday, and I'm very anxious about this because it's a different day and everyone's going to hop on a Saturday. So I'm reminding you again now, Katie Miltman will be joining us on Friday, the 28th at 5 p.m. my time, 12 noon Eastern time. So I think we might have to send out an adjusted calendar. So I'm saying that now. Next week, John Levy will be joining us. He's a very interesting man. Look him up. He ran a salon before COVID and had amazing, amazing people coming along to his home where he gave them dinner. He didn't know them, and they turned out to be like Nobel Prize winners and philosophers, and he has written a book about the subject. You're invited, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So I'd like to thank Pete again as we wrap up. Thanks all of you for joining us, and I'll just hand back now to Prakash to close the event.
Thank you all. Thanks, Louise. Thank you, Peter, too. And for our new members who joined us for the first time, I can see Aman here. I can see Bella. I think Bella is also new. Kodia. I can see a lot of people. Lavender, I can see out here. Karimi, right? Mani, Megan, and please keep on coming back. Purni. It's Simran out here. Your question was lovely, Simran, by the way. Please ask questions. It's a very legit question about the ethics of behavioral science. And Wesley, right? Tanisha, please keep on coming back for regular sessions. Make new friends out here. Pete, what a fantastic show. Before you go, right? Is there anything that you want to tell us? Any word of advice? Anything in general before you go? For all of us out here.
I'll tell you, this is the philosophy of my channel, and the main message that I preach on my YouTube channel is appreciate that you are a product of your environment. And so if you want to live a happier and healthier life, look first to your environment rather than within yourself, and try and design your environment in a way that's going to help you achieve your long-term goals. And that's the most important and valuable lesson you can learn from behavioral science is that lesson right there.
Thank you so much, man. It's really good. Thank you. Everyone, please stay safe. Wear your mask, even if you got your shots. But I think Fauci said you can keep the mask away if you got a shot. So yeah. But wear your mask otherwise, right? Stay safe.
Thanks
Pete,
so much.
thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Wise words. Thank you, Pete, so much for joining us.